Hello, welcome to lesson 2 of the Everybody's Shirt Sew Along. We're going to start by remembering to use the right needle and the right thread. If you're using lawn like I am here, and many of you are, you want to use a fine thread. So we're using a Coats Fine, and sometimes it's labeled paper piecing thread, and you'll see it has a lavender spool. So if you go to a Joann's or a store like that, that's where you'll find it. It's also available online, but you want a fine thread to sew lawn with, otherwise it's going to pucker and give you some trouble, especially with top stitching. I'm using a size 10 Schmetz needle that is a Microtex. That's what I happen to have. In the beginning we said 10 universal will work fine as well. If you're using regular cotton shirting like some of you are from the other kit that we offered, or that you may have purchased shirting, then you're probably going to be using a 12 universal needle, and basic construction thread will be just fine. Alright, so getting started, remember you have this booklet that came with your pattern. Like all of our patterns, we like to create a small book that sits beside the machine, and it gives you completely illustrated and written instructions. So you have all the details you need. No guesswork, no half-drawn illustrations, no brief sew this seam. We're even going to tell you exactly the seam allowance for every single process, because we are not your basic standard 5/8 inch seam allowance kind of pattern company. Alright, well, let's get started, and we're going to start here on page 10. You should already have accomplished everything on page 9, which is interfacing all the pieces that are necessary, but particularly for this, we're doing the right and left front plackets. For a woman's shirt, the buttonhole placket is on the right. Here we tell you to use a firm, a 1 1/4 firm strip, and a 1 1/4 soft. So that would be our light and stable, and the firm would be our medium firm, and then light and stable in the left side. This is all true if you're using a basic shirting weight fabric, but if you're using lawn, we are highly recommending that you only use the light and stable. So you'll add these two measurements together, which is 1 1/4, 1 1/4, and you can just cut a 2.5 inch piece of light and stable. Remember to leave about 1 inch out of the bottom. Don't go all the way to the bottom of your shirt tail, because you'll need, you don't want it to get too stiff when you roll that double rolled hem. Alright, so let's start with the dart, which you'll find on the bottom of page 10. And you can see I've already put one of the darts in, and we use a tracing wheel to mark it, and then we went through with another chalk and added, just so you'd be able to see it on camera. And this is one place where I do use pins, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this right in half, and by sticking the pin through the stitching line and making sure it lands on the stitching line on the other side, then I know I have it folded accurately. So right through that stitching line here, and then if it lands here, laying nice and flat, then I can pin it in place. And yes, on this dart I do use pins. It would be a good guess to just press it in half and stitch up the stitching line on one side, but I can tell you that chances are it'll slip a little bit, and in some places your dart isn't going to be accurate. And darts need to be accurate. They're pointing right at your bust, and anything that's pointing at your bust, you want it to look really nice. There we go. So you just work your way up to the tip here. Make sure that's folded right in half. And I'll just do one more double check at the widest part of the dart. Now hopefully you've adjusted these darts so that they land 1 inch below your apex. You don't want that dart, and some of us, depending on the placement of your bust or how tall or short you are, that dart might be landing way too short, or it might be going right up over your bust, and you don't want that. Darts are meant to land 1 inch below the bust. Now I see I don't want to start at the end of the dart, so I've made my first error of the day and put my pins on the wrong side. So let me just flip these over real quick. And we're just going to stitch this dart up. Now, I use for almost all construction a 3mm length stitch length. That's about 10 to 12 stitches per inch, and that is perfectly acceptable for garment construction. And I never go down to a 2.5 or a 2. And one of the reasons is I don't want, when I make a mistake, and oh, I do make mistakes, it's just too difficult to pull out. So remember, it's still thumb under, fingers on top. Use your left hand to guide, and also putting pressure with your fingertips to keep the fabric, the 2 layers, from sliding. It's just a little bit of pressure, a little pressure with the left hand and a little tension. I should have taken that pin out. Now what I'm going to do here might shock some of you, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep stitching after I go off the fabric. And the reason that we do that, and this is the way it's done in the industry, they don't back up, they don't have the time to stop and tie those threads. So by continuing stitching, these stitches are all locked together here, and then you just leave about anywhere from a 1/2 inch to a 1 inch tail. And that's it, and that's never going to come out. And if you look at your ready to wear, you're going to see that's the way they did it. So we've put our second dart in, got both darts accomplished. Now we want to do our button and buttonhole plackets. So let's start with the right side. So the right side has 2 fold lines. The left side does too, but the right side's fold lines are wider, and they're the exact width of the interfacing. So when you press this, you have a nice hard edge to press against, and it helps you keep it nice and neat. But press it on those fold lines. Remember, we've got the interfacing in here. This is our light and stable. We've left 1 inch at the bottom so that the hem will be softer and easier to work with. Now what we want to do is stitch 1/4 inch from this fold, the outside fold here now. So we're going to top stitch 1/4 inch, and it needs to be pretty accurate at that 1/4. And again, remember, we don't want this to get tweaked. And what I mean by tweaked is when you start to see little fold lines in the edge, if I can get them. When it starts to fold, that's because the bottom layer is going through faster than the top. So make sure you do your right hand, thumb under, fingers on top. Make sure this hand is working right along, and then you can stitch right up that 1/4 inch. Come back, get a hold of it again, making sure you've got some tension and you're not allowing that back layer to go through faster than the top. And the minute that you see that's happening, you've got to stop. Because otherwise you're just going to have a sloppy looking placket. Okay, so now this is the step. Pay very close attention because this is the step I get the most emails about. They get done and the neckline's not long enough to put their collar stand on. Why is one side of my neckline too short? And I know exactly what they've missed. They've missed the step that calls for turning this back out. So you want to fold this back out. Don't leave it folded in. It comes back out, and you see that 1/4 inch stitching you took has accomplished one side of your placket. Then you just go down the other side of the placket at 1/4 inch as well. Now hopefully you've used your stitch sample and tested your needle and thread to make sure that, you know, everything's going to look real nice. You don't want to wait till you're actually constructing. And I covered, you know, using a stitch sample several times, but specifically in lesson 1 we talked about that you needed to do that. So there we have the placket. It needs a good press, but there it is. All right, now that's our buttonhole placket, the right side of a woman's shirt. Men's, it would be the exact opposite, the left side. So on the left side, the button placket, we have a narrow placket and it has interfacing in it. And in this case, it's always going to be the light and stable. And those who bought kits, the light and stable came in your kit. Now what we want to do is stitch this in the same manner, but this time we're going to stitch a needle width away. And what I mean by a needle width away is here's our folded edge, and we want to be about the width of a needle from that edge, which means that we don't want to be on top of that edge, but we want to be slightly inside of it. And once I get going here, and you have to find the spot on your foot of your machine that's going to work for you. I usually use the inside of this foot, but most of you don't have a foot this narrow. So you're going to have to find and do a little practice ahead of time to find that sweet spot that's going to give you that needle width away. And why is that so important? Well, the needle width away is what's going to make it a more professional finish. And you can see now, when so many times I see top stitching that is, well, like we did with the other band, 1/4 inch away. The problem with that in this case, this edge would roll up. And every time you laundered this, it would need extra pressing there because it's just not going to lay flat. And it's not going to look as nice. So needle width away, if you don't already have that in your repertoire, you need to start practicing it because it's how you put pockets on and so many things. Top stitching waistbands. So we're just going to go down both the inside and outside of this placket a needle width away. Now this is what I think looks nice. However, you're going to see sometimes a placket that doesn't stitch the outside edge. I don't know if that just saves them money or they don't think they want to put it there. I don't know, but sometimes they don't stitch this outside edge. But I think it adds stability and symmetry. And always, always thumb under, fingers on top, because you can even tweak top stitching. or tweak the fabric when you're top stitching. So all right, so make sure you do both darts, and that's the front placket on the left side, and here's our right side. And these will, and you'll notice that I use this particular marking on the fabric as my center front. So when I lay these over top of each other, the pattern looks very contiguous. I think this is going to be a really sharp blouse. All right, so our next step is to work, we're going to switch now from page 10 to page 11. And now we're going to do the yokes. Some of you may have been brave enough to choose the yoke for back B. And of course, this same yoke you could use on either A or B. It's the same size. It will fit. This one is so that you can chevron the stripes on the back of the yoke. Let me show you what I mean right here. And that always adds some nice back interest. And depending on the stripe, it can be really dramatic. So if you want to do that, that's what you'll do next. But those of us who are using the one-piece yokes, we've cut out two. One's going to be the actual yoke that's shown on the outside of the garment, or faces the public, as we like to say. The other yoke is going to be your facing. So we'll get our back all set up here. And I always keep my pattern pieces with my, the actual pattern with the pieces until I go to construct them. That way, if I've made any errors or I've confused myself in any way, I've got that piece right here. And I can double check everything or put the notch in that I forgot or whatever that might be. Now in this case, I have to be very careful because this shirt is for a specific person and she is very asymmetrical. So I have to make sure, and I've written it on here, that the right side, this is the right side because her shoulder is much longer on the right side than it is on the left. Or by much longer, I guess I mean enough to make a big difference if I put it on backwards. So I know this is the one that goes on the outside. So some of you have written and said you have asymmetrical shoulders too. So if that's the case, be very careful and don't make the mistake I did last week when I just went, as I always do, and just cut two yokes with the pattern piece right side up. Because that won't work. You've got to have a reverse. So make sure that you cut one right side up and one with the pattern piece turned over. All right, so now we're going to sew the yoke to the back. And in this case, there's no significant, there's no ease. So it's just going to be a straight fit. And we will have, of course, marked our center backs. And you see, I always do a little slit, and that's what our notches are. But I've also gone and chalked it so that we could see it on camera as we do it. This one is an actual 3/8 inch seam allowance, but wait, only sew this at 1/4. Because in effect, all we're doing is kind of machine basting this one in place so that we can put the second one on. Now, professional shirt makers, people working in factories, they're going to put both yokes on at the same time. So they'll have the other one underneath. But for this pattern guide and for people who are new to no-pin sewing, I suggest you do them separately, at least for the first shirt. So get everything lined up, and now you're going to stitch this at 1/4. Just make sure everything's matching. The minute something's, you come back, if I came back here and this wasn't matching up, I'd stop right now because I've let something get loose of me. And so this is to keep the bottom from going through faster. So these fingers are helping. Thumb under, fingers on top. Tilt that fabric so that that bottom layer can't go through faster, and you'll get a very accurate seam. Most likely even more accurate than you would with when you relied on pins. The problem with relying on pins is we are putting our faith in a process that may or may not work. Rely on your own hands and how to feed the fabric, and it works every time. So we've got our yoke on, but now we need our facing. So I'm going to put the facing on the same way, but this time is a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And the reason we do this one at 1/4 and this one at 3/8 is that we don't have to worry to get it smack on. If we put this one on at 3/8, we would have to stitch exactly on top of that previous stitching when we put the facing on. And that's just a pain. And so doing this at 3/8, we know that you'll never have to be smack on with the previous stitching. All right, so match up your center. Thumb under, fingers on top. Go for it. 3/8 inch seam allowance. You'll see some little yellow marks here, and that's because I wanted to always not make the mistake of putting this as the outside piece. I wanted to remind myself that this is the facing, not the yoke. Okay, so now we have both yokes. And they match, yes. All right, so now we want to sew the shoulder seams front to back. So what I want you to do is open this up and get this one out of the way. So get that underneath so that only this one is on top. And now we're going to sew the fronts to the back at the shoulder seams. Okay. Now again, this is going to be the same kind of concept that we sewed this seam here. Is we're going to sew this twice. So the first time we're going to sew it at 1/4. And if that's not making sense at the moment, don't worry, it's going to in just a few seconds. So we're going to sew this at 1/4. Oh. All right, bear with me, my needle came unthreaded. Okay, get in there. All right. Back at it. And again, 1/4 inch seam for the first go around. We're going to have a second go around, and that is going to be when we accomplish a burrito technique. Now rather than cut the thread and start over again, I'm just going to line this up and just stitch from one to the next. Okay, and then we just have this little thread to snip, 1/4 inch. All right, now, this is where you might get confused for a minute. So I'm going to try to do it with the same orientation as you see on page 12 so that it helps make more sense. So if that was the case, we'd be looking like this. Okay? And what we want to do is, let's see, yeah, we want to sew this shoulder seam to this shoulder seam. Now in home sewing methods, what they have you do, and they do it at 5/8 too, they have you come up and fold this under and hand stitch it down. It never looks as nice and it's never going to hold as well, and it takes a lot more time. So if you want a professional looking shirt, you're going to love this because it's so easy. So pick this seam up and then bring this piece around to this shoulder. Okay, I'm going to do that again. See, this is coming around. This is the yoke. This is the facing. I'm going to bring them around and sandwich the front in there. So I'm going to match that seam. Around so they can kind of see. It's going to look kind of messy. You see everything's kind of shoved in there, but if you keep the shoulder seam nice and accurate and sew it at 3/8, all will be wonderful. Darn it. I don't know if that thread's getting cut off too short or what. Alright, keep an eye on that. Alright, 3/8, back to the shoulder seam. All right, now make sure all the layers are nice and flush. Okay, so here we are. Now, you just pull your shirt back out. And there is your shoulder seam, completely accomplished and neat and clean on the outside and on the inside. Now you're probably going to want to watch that again, but the directions again are right here on page 12. All right, now the next thing we want to do, of course you want to do both shoulders, but I'm not going to waste your time doing both shoulders right now. I'm going to go ahead and do the next step, which, and again, as usual, and those of you who have followed my sew-alongs, you know that I do things out of order often. So we haven't put our side backs in yet. So I'm going to put one of the side backs. Now we're ready to put our side backs in. And I just want to remind you that I did this slightly out of order, which I'm known to do. So we would have done the side backs if you're following the guide exactly before we did the shoulder seams. But it really, they don't impact each other, so it doesn't matter. But we have the side back piece here. And I'm going to put that against the feed dog, match the notches, and stitch it up at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And remember, our pattern guide for every step is going to tell you the particular seam allowance you need for that step. So it's not like you have to jot down a lot of notes or go back and look at the tissue to find out what the seam allowance is. All right, so we want 3/8. All right, so once you have it anchored, I like to say that needle down is my third hand because it holds it in place while I come back here. And again, I've marked these notches so that you can see them, but otherwise, normally I just do a little slit. All right, so we're going to come up to that first notch, add a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to go find the next notch. I'm going to match those up. There we go. Make sure everything is nice and flush, and then these fingers will hold it in place. Okay. Okay, now let me point something out. When you have pieces like this and they're going at opposite curves, so to speak, when you see the fabric here intersects right at the seam allowance, that's when you know you have it in the right place. We're used to seams being all squared off, but in many cases, underarm seams and things, you're going to have it slightly off. Here at the bottom, it does the same thing. This piece comes out a little bit further, but when they intersect, you know you've got it at the right spot. So that's how you know where to start and stop. And then you've got your two notches in between. And this makes such a beautiful shaping to the back. And so you're going to put both of those on. Then you want to serge finish this seam and that seam. Then we'll go in and we're going to top stitch. But first, before I top stitch, I'll top stitch one of these seams for you, but I'm going to press it first because you have to. You can see how it's kind of soft and bumpy. You don't want that. You want a nice hard flat surface to top stitch on. It will be easier and look nicer every time. So we're going to go over to the ironing station and I'm going to press these seams. So I'm going to press one shoulder seam and then this back yoke seam. So what we want to do is I like to press up because you want it nice and flat. You don't want some of this rolling down. So press that up. Now before I use the clapper, which I am going to use, I want to check the other side because sometimes that's, see how there's some movement here. See that? That is still folded down. So I want that one up too. So I'm going to use my iron and my steam to make sure that's all completely up. Now I'm going to come back to the right side, and this time when I press it, I'm going to clap it. So we're going to press this, give it a shot of steam, and then set the clapper right down on it and give it a little press. Don't slam it. That won't do any better work than just holding it and pressing it. When you take it off, you can see, you can just show them this seam, this end of the seam versus that one. And it makes a big difference when you're top stitching, because you want to top stitch it flat, and when you use that needle width away and you top stitch it flat, it stays there. So I'm just going to top stitch this back seam. You're going to do the same thing with the shoulder, both shoulders, but I'm just going to do the one because it's the same thing, shoulders or this back seam. It's just all about that needle width away. Let's see which way I want to go. And again, I like to use the inside of my foot as my guide. But you see, I don't have any worry about this fabric rippling or being all soft and moving around on me, because I have pressed it down and clapped it with that hardwood clapper. If you're in the market for wooden pressing tools, we do carry a beautiful line. We have a craftsman make them for us, a woodworker, and they're beautiful. But if you have purchased one someplace else or you plan to, make sure that it is a hardwood. Sometimes people aren't aware of what all the properties need to be of a clapper, and they think, well, I'll make some, and they make them out of a soft wood. That won't work. The reason a clapper works is because the hardwood soaks up the moisture from the steam, and that is what allows the fabric to lay flat. When you press fabric, the fibers will lay down. The harder you press, the more steam you use, those fibers will flatten right out. But as the fiber cools, those fibers start to raise back up. But if you clap them, and so they cool while they're being flattened, they stay that way until they're made wet or steamed again. So you're going to want, again, check the pattern guide, but you're going to top stitch this seam, both shoulder seams, and after you serge finish these side back seams, you're going to top stitch those as well. So use a 3 thread, not a 4 thread, to finish off that seam. You don't need to trim anything off of it, and then top stitch it a needle width away. And come back next time for lesson 3.